They say the Middle Ages were ruled by faith and steel priests in cathedrals, knights in armor, kings on their thrones. But, in the shadows of monasteries and candlelit chambers, another story was being written. Story not Bahadals, but of buddies. Medieval physicians experimented on men and women in ways that blurred the line between healing and obsession. These were secrets never meant to be spoken, yet whispered through time. Imagine a chamber of stone, torches flickering against walls lined with scrolls. Physicians gathered, not in open hospitals, but in hidden rooms where silence was law. Anatomy was explored, not with precision, but with crude instruments, with rituals that combined faith, superstition, and desire. And those who entered these chambers often left not healed but haunted. To understand these experiments, you must understand medieval medicine. It was a strange mix of science, astrology, and theology. Doctors studied humus blood, phlegm, bile-believing imbalance caused illness. Patients were treated not only with herbs or prayers, but with examinations so invasive, they felt less like healing and more like trials. Can you picture the fear of being at their mercy? Some physicians wrote of tests performed in secrecy. They claimed to study fertility, yet their methods crossed lines we would call unthinkable today. Oils, leeches, and crude tools were applied to the most private parts of the human body. Was it medicine or spectacle? For the patient, it must have felt like both. In universities like Bologna and Paris, medical scholars dissected bodies, sometimes criminals, sometimes those too poor to refuse. Experiments were carried out on living patients, all in the name of knowledge. But how much of it was true science, and how much was cloaked curiosity? Even the church looked the other way, so long as the physicians claimed their work served God's design. These same physicians swore oaths to heal, yet their curiosity often turned into cruelty. They charted bodily functions in ways that left patients exposed and humiliated. Imagine lying on a wooden table, bound by expectation, while a circle of men in robes whispered notes over every reaction. To be both studied and shamed, that was the essence of these forbidden medical rituals. One chilling record speaks of doctors using heat, smoke, and pungent herbs, claiming they could diagnose a woman's hidden illnesses by how her body reacted. These procedures were less treatment than torment, and yet they were written into manuals as legitimate practice. The body was reduced to a spectacle, a stage on which pain and dignity were stripped away in the name of knowledge. Not every physician was a monster. Some genuinely sought to heal. But the secrecy, the rituals, and the blending of medicine with superstition created an atmosphere where exploitation thrived. Patients had little choice, for doctors held not only knowledge but power, and in that imbalance, compassion often vanished. The experiments often blurred into obsession. Some healers studied fertility by forcing crude trials, believing conception could be measured through invasive rituals. Others mixed strange potions, combining herbs, minerals, even crushed stones. These trials were less about healing than control, about bending the mysteries of the body into a framework that fit their beliefs. Patients entered expecting healing, but left with shame. Families brought loved ones to physicians, desperate for remedies. Yet often those loved ones became unwilling participants in experiments never meant to be remembered. When results were written down, they were stripped of humanity, reduced to cold notes and diagrams that told nothing of the suffering behind them. One account describes crude surgeries performed without true anesthesia, patients given only wine, or prayers, or cold iron pressed against the skin. These physicians believed the body revealed its secrets only when pushed to the edge. The line between healer and tormentor blurred until it vanished. And in their pursuit of knowledge, mercy was often the first sacrifice. In many ways, these experiments were less about the patient and more about the physician's reputation. To publish a new method, to impress wealthy patrons, this was the true prize. The human subjects became little more than tools, sacrificed on the altar of ambition. For, in the race to be remembered, compassion was a burden few could afford. The rituals grew darker when sexuality was involved. Believing desire itself could cause illness, physicians attempted to cure it through bizarre practices. Imagine the confusion of patients told their natural instincts were sicknesses, their bodies reduced to experiments in morality disguised as medicine. In their hands, healing became judgment, and the body a battlefield between sin and science. Even in the cruelty, one truth emerged: the power of fear. Patients feared disease, they feared damnation, and they feared the very men meant to heal them. Doctors held authority not only over the body, but over the soul. And in that fear, obedience flourished, turning medicine into a silent pact between desperation and control. It was a faith bat en terror. In monasteries, records speak of monks who blended prayer with invasive rituals, believing the body could be purified through trials of pain. To suffer in silence was seen as virtue, and so the silence surrounding these experiments grew deeper. Who would dare speak against those who claimed to serve both God and science? Pain, they said, was not punishment but revelation. What of those who tried to resist? Patients who cried out, families who objected, many were silenced. Their voices erased, their names forgotten. The stories we piece together today come not from their pride, but from the shadows between their lines. Every discovery carved from suffering carries a ghostly reminder that progress, when born of cruelty, always leaves a stain on history. Were these experiments truly medicine, or something darker? Knowledge did grow, discoveries were made, yet at the expense of countless lives treated as less than human. The truth is, history often remembers the progress, not the pain, and in doing so, it forgets the cries that built the foundation of that progress. Some rituals crossed into what we would now call cruelty without purpose. Physicians tested bizarre potions said to influence fertility or purity, forcing patients to endure burns and sickness as results. To them, the suffering was a necessary trial, and yet, such experiments were celebrated, even rewarded by rulers who craved answers. In courts across Europe, kings and queens summoned physicians to perform demonstrations. These trials were spectacles, with nobles watching as patients were examined or dosed with potions before their very eyes. Medicine became performance. And in those glittering halls, compassion often mattered less than spectacle. A life was just another show for the powerful to applaud. Many of these records were later erased, not because they were failures but because they succeeded too well at showing the cruelty behind the mask of medicine. For centuries, scribes scratched out names, burned scrolls, and rewrote history to hide what was done in those chambers. Yet the faint traces remain, haunting the margins of forgotten texts like ghosts refusing to be silenced. Were these physicians monsters, or men bound by ignorance? They lived in a world where knowledge was sacred, where to seek answers was seen as noble. Yet, in their hunger for discovery, they crossed lines that destroyed lives. And in doing so, they revealed how easily the pursuit of truth can turn into the worship of power. Can you imagine lying in a cold chamber, the eyes of learned men fixed upon you, every movement noted, every reaction dissected? Your body no longer your own, but a vessel for their ambitions. This was the fate of countless souls whose suffering was never meant to be remembered. Each scream, each trembling breath became another line in the silent story of human endurance. Some experiments were said to blend ritual and superstition. Patients were given crushed stones, ground metals, even powders from gemstones, believed to hold power. These were not cures, they were trials of endurance. To the healers, pain was proof, and silence was the measure of faith. Each concoction was a gamble between life and death, a test of how far human faith could stretch before it finally broke. Why were such acts allowed? The answer lies in fear and trust. People believed doctors were guided by divine wisdom, and so they submitted. To question them was to question both knowledge and God. And in that blind devotion, the cruelest acts found their justification. Blind faith, after all, can turn even mercy into a weapon. Even centuries later, fragments of these accounts remain. They speak of patients stripped of dignity, of healers who blurred the line between cure and cruelty. They remind us that progress has always carried a cost paid not by those who wrote history but by those erased from it. Their silence, etched into forgotten pages, became the truest testimony of all. Were these physicians truly healers, or were they something far more dangerous? Their experiments reveal not only the darkness of medieval medicine, but the fragility of human trust. To surrender one's body is the greatest act of faith. And once that faith is betrayed, no cure can heal what Secunda left behind. For every wound of flesh eventually closes, but betrayal leaves a scar that never fades. Generations later, the stories survive not in proud chronicles, but in hidden, margin scribbles, burned manuscripts, whispered rumors. They were never meant for our ears. And yet, here we are, listening to echoes of chambers where pain was called progress. The walls may have crumbled, but the echoes still remember. And through those echoes, the forgotten demand to be heard once more. When you think of medieval medicine, do you picture herbs and prayers? Or do you see the shadowed rooms, the trembling patients, the physicians whose curiosity outweighed their compassion? Some truths were meant to be buried. But the past does not stay buried forever, because history, no matter how silent, always finds a way to speak again. And when it does, it reminds us that progress built on suffering is never truly healed.